the meta problem of consciousness is the problem of why we think there is a hard problem of consciousness. So, and I mean, I'll give you a more nuanced view of this in a bit, but more or less, it's really the question of why do we think consciousness is so puzzling? And I want to kind of motivate this by means of the heart problem. And obviously, you've heard a statement of the heart problem 1,000 times, so I try to keep it brief. And also, I want to motivate this idea from two perspectives. So, from the perspective of the realist in terms of consciousness, which Chalmers is, obviously. So, if you think consciousness exists and it has some ontological status, that is not just described by reductionism, right? You can't just say, oh, it's this and this function. Well, actually, I mean, there's some subtleties to that, but basically, this is for people who think, okay, there is a hard problem of consciousness and there is something there that is to be explained. So basically, the hard and easy problems are defined this way. Everything that, so understanding the brain as a system that produces behavior and that executes cognitive functions and so on, all of these are easy problems. So just basically characterizing the brain in such a way that you understand all of its behaviors. And then, as opposed to that, we have the hard problem, which is even if you do characterize all of these behaviors and functions, that at least to some people still leaves open the question of why is all of this associated with subjective experience, with a feeling of it is like something to be me right now. And so that would be the hard problem. And in some sense, it really seems like no matter how much you sort of explain the easy problems, you'll never really get to the hard problem. It's seemingly out of the reach of science if you think about it in these terms, because no matter which experiment you perform, all you ever measure is function and not pure experience, basically. But or so this is just another way to visualize it. We have all these easy problems. Maybe one is movement, one is sensory perception, one is math, whatever. But none of these really seem to cross this barrier to the heart problem. At least you think so. But there's one problem that seems inherently linked to the heart problem, which is the meta problem. So there is one, basically, I'm arguing here, or Chalmers is arguing, that it would be really weird if it had nothing to do with the heart problem. So that problem is basically the problem of why, for example, we're talking about the heart problem in the first place. So obviously, on some level, this is still an easy problem. It's still just behavior. It's just function. I, make sounds with my mouth. There's nothing magical here, but at the same time, imagine this had nothing to do with the actual heart problem. That'd be a huge coincidence, because if that were the case, if our talking about the heart problem had nothing to do with it, would just be a huge coincidence that we talk about it in the right way at all, right? I mean, because then there would be no reason for us to, well, it would be a huge coincidence, basically. And actually, that kind of leads me to also the motivation for illusionists, because this is actually a good argument for why the whole idea of the heart problem might be maybe not so sound. So illusionists, if they found a solution to the meta problem, basically they could dissolve the heart problem, because they could say, okay, we found out why we think there's a problem here of consciousness being puzzling, but they don't have this sort of axiom of, oh, I think it exists, right? And so if you don't have that and you explain our behavior of talking about it, there's really nothing else you need to do, right? You've solved the heart problem and you're done. So, I mean, personally, yeah, I think actually it's pretty logically sound, the whole case for illusionism. I mean, yeah, personally, it's more on an axiomatic basis that I feel like it's kind of weird. But yeah, so it doesn't matter which one, like which camp you belong to. It's going to be a useful problem either way. And so I kind of want to talk about more specifically how should we tackle the meta problem? Like, how should we define it maybe a bit more rigorously, and what would be a valid solution, or what shape would a valid solution take on? Then I'll talk about some potential speculative solutions that have been proposed. I'll talk about what the meta problem means for existing theories of consciousness. And then I'll wrap this up by talking a bit about, okay, what does this all mean? Or how would solutions to the meta problem relate to the actual existence of consciousness, its ontological status? So first of all, let's maybe be a bit more precise about what the meta problem is. So what is really the explanandum? What is the thing that we want to explain? And I've basically said before that this would be, for example, us stating the hard problem, but it's more than just that, or at least we can be a bit more precise about it. So first of all, similar to neural correlates of consciousness, we don't really want to explain us the act of talking, right? Because there's a lot of confounding factors there. We don't really care of our ability to speak, or we don't care about our ability to, translate ideas into language. That's not really what we're after. What we're really after is the disposition in us that we get to, that then leads us to the formulation of the hard problem, right? It's some kind of abstract representation of, oh, there's a problem here, and there's something here that we want to explain. And so Chalmers calls this disposition, or these dispositions, problem intuition. So this is what we want to explain. It's the problem intuitions. And now, again, one problem intuition would be, oh, there's a hard problem of consciousness. We want to explain why certain people would say that. But we can also be a bit more precise about that and sort of divide it into a bit more specific intuitions. And some of them are kind of overlapping, but it still kind of helps to be more precise, I believe. Whoops. All right. So okay, first, basically, is the explanatory intuition, which is that consciousness is hard to explain. So this is maybe the most direct interpretation of the hard problem. There's some kind of explanatory gap between function and experience. Like, even if we functionally characterize the brain completely, there's still some kind of gap left that hasn't been addressed. And so this is basically the intuition that functionalism is not enough here. Then there's metaphysical intuitions, and they're very related to the explanatory ones, but we can frame these more as, okay, consciousness has some fundamental existence, maybe next to physics, or maybe as part of physics. And I mean, there's also some, pretty well-known physicists that have expressed this sentiment, like Max Planck. So this is really the idea that, okay, just beyond structure and function of physics, it has some intrinsic existence. And then there's knowledge intuitions, which kind of boil down to, okay, if I'm conscious as a conscious system, if that system is me, then I have some extra knowledge in addition to just seeing that system from the outside, or characterizing that system from the outside. For example, the thought experiment of Mary, who's this, I believe the story goes something like, she's a neuroscientist, grows up in this black and white room. She has a fully functioning visual system, but she never sees red in this room. She knows everything about neuroscience. She knows everything about what goes on in the brain when seeing red. But when she steps out and sees red for the first time, she gains some new knowledge, because for the first time, she's actually in a state where she's experiencing red. So, I mean, again, like, some people might disagree with this fact that she actually learns anything new, but at least some people have this intuition. And then, related is like the idea that, oh, it's really hard for me to have any idea of what it's like to be you guys. So kind of similar. And then there's modal intuition. So modal facts in philosophy, apparently I learned this means facts about what could be possible, what could be conceivable. And so basically this includes the zombie argument, right? Where we feel like, oh, shouldn't it somehow be possible to have a zombie that's exactly functionally equivalent and doesn't have an inner experience? And then the example I really like is the possibility of color inversion. So it's like, you could really imagine like your experience of life with everything being the same, except say red and green, the experience of red and the experience of green are switched. And so everything that's red is green, and everything that's green is red. And actually, but you'd still call these colors what you called them before, and all the objects would be switched in the same way. So really, your behavior would not change at all, right? So again, maybe that's not possible, but it's definitely conceivable. And if it's not possible, it would be interesting to know why it's not possible. But anyways, the fact is, we at least some people have the intuition that this is possible. So that would be an example of something non-functional too. And then, so Chalmers kind of says that, okay, these four maybe are the main intuitions that we're trying to explain. He mentioned some other ones. I just added two here, which I think are quite interesting. So first one is the value intuition. So this is definitely one that I share, but I know not everyone does. But some people think there's a special value associated with consciousness. And basically, to some people, it's basically a universe with consciousness as opposed to one without is a universe that's meaningful. Or basically, if there's valence associated with consciousness, then that has, some sort of moral implications. Again, even if it's not true, right? People believe it, so we want to figure out why they believe it. And then finally, this is also one I really resonate with, just sort of this idea that colors have some primitive, irreducible quality. I mean, we talked a lot about like the retinas and stuff. So like if I want to convey red to someone, really all I can do is list other red objects. I can never really get to the character of red. And I really feel like there is a character there. And I feel like a description of the universe or it's hard to have a description of the universe where you can reduce this to something else. Because it's just hard for me to conceive to reduce just the experience of redness to something else. Okay, and so this is basically what we want to explain. And then Chalmers talks about, okay, what should an explanation look like, or what requirements should it fulfill? And here, what he says first is that explanations should be topic neutral. So basically, he sees the meta problem as explaining phenomenal reports in topic neutral terms that do not mention consciousness. Now, this is important, first of all, to leave this research endeavor open to both illusionists and realists, so that illusionists don't feel like, okay, or that sorry, to rephrase, more like that any solution to the meta problem will be accepted by both camps. And then secondly, it would be also kind of weird if your explanation of the meta problem includes consciousness at some point, where consciousness causes something, because then you really didn't explain anything, you just kind of moved the problem somewhere else. So kind of makes sense, I guess, to have this as a requirement. And yeah, so what definitely falls into this category, for example, are any physical or functional explanations, among which would also be some computational explanation. So if you could design some algorithm or some machine learning model which produces, statements such as, oh, red has some irreducible quality to me, or there's a hard problem of consciousness, then that'd be pretty good. I mean, that'd be a nice solution to the meta problem. Obviously, like if you have some GPT, whatever iteration, right, and it says something like, yeah, there's a hard problem of consciousness, that's not really, I mean, that probably would not count. But yeah, so we'd have to be careful about the constraints of these systems, but I feel like this is definitely a very promising approach, potentially. So, I mean, okay, so Chalmers defined this meta problem in like 2018, but I mean, this idea has been around for a while, maybe under different names and so on. So there's a lot of solutions that have already been proposed. And so most, or at least a lot of these solutions use the idea of introspective models. That is, representations in the brain that have as the object of their representation other states or other representations in the brain. So for example, we could have some first order representation of our visual field in our visual cortex, and then in some higher brain area, we have a higher order representation of that representation of the visual field. Now, it could be a higher order representation of something conscious, such as the visual field, but it doesn't have to be. And actually, I want to mention this here because Chalmers often mentions beliefs as a kind of counterexample to debunking some potential solutions to the meta problem, because beliefs are also higher order representations, in the sense that, for example, you might have some fact in your brain of like, oh, Paris is in France, or whatever, the moon landing is real, and then you have this higher order representation of, oh, I believe this, right? Or you didn't believe in the moon landing, you'd have the higher order representation of, okay, this fact, I don't believe in that fact. I guess that kind of makes sense. And so that would just be another example of a higher order representation. So they don't have to be necessarily conscious, and I guess that's going to be important. But the idea, I guess, is in general that these higher order representations maybe in some way just induce behavior of us saying that there's something weird about our consciousness, right? The idea is that these higher order concepts play some specific role here. But obviously, this by itself is by no means any explanation, but it could serve as a framework. So one idea that goes a bit more into details is the phenomenal concept idea. And here, basically, the idea is that we have higher order concepts of conscious content, as I kind of mentioned before. For example, higher order representation of your visual field. So that would be a phenomenal concept. And then you also have other concepts in your brain that directly refer to some object in physical space, right? I have a concept of a tree that is distinct from maybe a higher order concept of me seeing the tree. And so one idea is that the phenomenal concepts have some special property that maybe the physical concepts don't. And because they have the special property, we think that consciousness itself is kind of special. Again, still kind of vague, but maybe it helps to just see these as different. And a related idea is that inherently these two kinds of concepts in our brain are treated separately, so they don't communicate with each other, which kind of leads us to believe that, oh, because our representations are completely incompatible in our brain, leads us to believe that, oh, maybe phenomenal consciousness is completely separate from physics, even though that's certainly the case in our brain, but not in reality. So basically, it's a form of so proponents of this theory kind of acknowledge an epistemic explanatory gap. They say, okay, yes, you do really experience something new when you see red because you form a phenomenal concept, whereas otherwise you only form a physical concept. But they argue that to jump from this to the conclusion that, okay, ontologically, these are separate things, consciousness is separate from physics, is not correct. So yeah, and this whole strategy, this whole way of thinking is also called a phenomenal concept strategy. But so here, actually, we can use maybe the beliefs as some kind of counterexample, because beliefs are also phenomenal concept that might also be, separate from physical concepts, but we don't have the same rich experience associated with beliefs. Then there's the argument of introspective opacity. So maybe, yeah, this is, not that powerful of an argument, but basically the idea is that, so Chalmers mentions this philosopher who gives this example of, okay, there's this circus trick or whatever, where you kind of, a woman is in the box or something like that, and then at some point you don't see her head, and you kind of jump to the conclusion from, or you jump from perceiving the woman you jump from not perceiving the woman's head to perceiving that the woman has no head. And so similarly, maybe we jump from not perceiving the underlying mechanisms of consciousness to believing that, oh, there are no underlying physical mechanisms of consciousness. Also, by the way, just if something doesn't make sense, please tell me. Okay, cool. So yeah, I mean, yeah, this one, yeah, this could be maybe part of a solution, right? But it really also doesn't explain the exact nature of our problem intuitions, at least not all of them. And also, again, the same could be said for belief, right? We also don't know the underlying physical mechanisms of belief, and yet we don't think that belief is as rich of a phenomenal experience as vision, for example. then there's this idea of immediate knowledge. Now, I think I understand it, but maybe I understand it the wrong way. But basically, Chalmers gives this example of, oh, okay, we have some agent that sees, for example, a green tree, and it represents this green tree as a first order concept, first order representation. And then he also has a higher order representation of actually seeing that tree, or maybe just the color green. And then if you ask this, and let's assume the system also has some ability to answer questions about its reasoning. So you ask the system, okay, why do you see why do you say that you, or why do you see green? And basically the system will notice, oh, I have a higher order representation of seeing green, and so it's like, oh, I'm representing seeing green. So basically it's like it justifies it's seeing green, but by this higher order representation. But then if you ask it, oh, why are you saying that you're representing this first order representation? Well, it has no further higher order representation that refers to that one. So it's like, it has nothing else to refer to, right? It has no further representation that says, oh, I'm representing this. So at some point the chain stops. And at that point, all the system can really say is, oh, I don't really know. I just am in this state. So yeah, this one, I don't know, it kind of makes sense to me, but I wouldn't say completely. Yeah. So this one I really like, because this one addresses this idea of colors having some fundamental character. For example, the redness of red not really being reducible to anything else. And maybe, yeah, to illustrate this, maybe, you know, if you see this green rectangle and you had to describe your experience of this green rectangle, one thing you could say is, okay, it's kind of got two components. It's got a shape and a color. And if you look at the shape, sure, in some sense, you're experiencing a rectangle, and that experience goes beyond the simple perception of the individual lines or the individual dots. But if you had to describe your quality of seeing a rectangle, it's quite easy to break it down. You could always say, oh yeah, I can break this down to lines, angles, dots, and all these elements that you break it down to are also concepts that are valid in other domains, right? I mean, lengths and angles, that's also something real in the physical world. So you can really break it down to something that you can relate to other things. Yeah, you can basically go down to very fundamental ideas. Whereas with green, there's nothing more that you can do, really. I mean, I can't break down green any further. And also, I really can't associate green with anything else than simply the color. Green to me has no other sort of explanatory value, and it really seems fundamentally irreducible. So why could this be? So I mean, the physical reality of it all is like we see wavelengths of light, different frequencies. Well, yeah, electromagnetic waves of different frequencies, and they correspond to different objects, just reflecting light differently, right? But we only see the different frequencies. So that's, I mean, that's the physical reality of it. Now, the question is, how would we represent something like that, right? We just have different waves from different frequencies from different objects. Now, one way you could potentially represent this in a meaningful way would be to say that, oh, or to model the actual underlying physical attributes of surfaces of objects, right? Because really color doesn't really exist. It's just different surfaces reflect light differently. That's the reality of it. So if you were able to model this, you know, this surface is constituted this way, then you could really model it as something that is more fundamental and goes down deeper into just simpler concepts. But it's, of course, very unrealistic for us to do so because we have no idea what the surface properties are of objects. So that seems quite inefficient and impossible. Now, another way you could think of modeling different colors, and again, really sort of on a first principles sort of basis, all you see is just, okay, different objects are sending me different wavelengths. And so basically what you could do is you could just maybe relationally represent different objects, right? You could maybe link all objects of the same color to each other. All the white ones, for example, a white cat, or like a red dress and a red flower, you just link them all in this huge network. But that also seems, and again, this is very hand wavy, but it seems like this would be very inefficient also because you'd have the same object in different colors. So you need to sort of duplicate it and then link it differently in many graphs. So yeah, it seems kind of inefficient and not realistic to do that. So the other option would be for our brain to introduce basically dummy variables. So instead of linking all red objects, we just all link them to the dummy concept of red. So essentially, we're labeling them with a new quantity that has no actual bearing on anything else. We just introduced it. Yeah, we can't connect it to anything else. We just use it because it's more efficient to actually represent different objects reflecting light differently. So essentially, we're introducing a new dimension in the way we encode things for simplicity, basically, and because we just don't have access to the underlying physical reality. And so what's nice about this, and maybe if you compare it to belief, is that, okay, so in perception, in terms of color, we basically label. So let's assume we do that. We introduce these dummy concepts and we label them. That would be quite different from how, a lot of people think beliefs work, which is much more relationally based. So if the cat sits on the bed, then that's basically some kind of relation between the cat, the bed, and maybe the concept of something being on top of something else. So again, this irreducible quality that we associate with color and that makes it sort of ineffable is really just a dummy concept that our brain introduces to simplify things. And the same thing, or this is a similar idea. So we could also apply this whole idea to more abstract states, such as, for example, the experience of being aware of anything at all, or the experience of attending to something. And so, for example, I mean, if you look at some visual scene, then so let's say you perceive your visual field. There's a lot of complex relations going on. So first of all, you're seeing your visual field from a certain vantage point. Within your visual field, there are relations of things being next to each other and so on. And on top of that, you're also attending to different parts of the visual field. So this whole reality of what's happening is quite complex. And if you were to model this, sort of mathematically or explicitly, it would probably also be quite inefficient and maybe too much. So the idea here is that whereas before we introduced this stand-in for maybe physical surface properties, now we introduce this stand-in for the complexity of all the relations that are involved in perception. And so actually, this is also kind of the idea of, wait, I'm blanking on his name. The attention schema, Graziano. So Graziano's attention schema theory, which I haven't really read the paper of, but apparently what he proposes is that consciousness, awareness, I think he uses the term awareness, is basically a simplified model of what's going on with attention. Attention is very complicated, but you're simplifying it to this proxy, which is awareness. So it's this new concept that you again come up with, and maybe thus is super hard to explain to someone because you're kind of introducing something that has no equivalent in the physical world, and that's basically what awareness is. So, oh yeah, but Chalmers is so I think Chalmers is a bit skeptical in terms of it only being attention. He proposes that awareness could be not just a proxy for attention, but maybe a simplified model of all these relations we just discussed. So in addition to attention, also relations within the percept, and also the relation of how is the subject really in relation to the actual object. So awareness could really be this sort of just pragmatic, simplified stand-in for what's actually happening. And then if you try to explain it, yeah, again, it's probably it would be problematic. So then basically Chalmers kind of summarizes, he tries to maybe combine all of these ideas. So he says that we have introspective models, deploying introspective concepts, which we discussed as also being different in terms of physical concepts and phenomenal concepts of our internal states that are largely, again, yeah, exactly independent of our physical concepts. And these concepts are introspectively opaque, like this idea with not perceiving a head and then thinking that there's no head, which then, yeah, it's not revealing the mechanism. And our perceptual models attribute these primitive qualities, for example, like color, or maybe also something like taste to the world. And our introspective models attribute primitive mental relations to those qualities, for example, for, again, like perspective and attention and so on. And then we seem to have immediate knowledge that we stand in these primitive mental relations to primitive qualities. So yeah, that was this idea of, the agent not being able to justify just the immediate fact that the agent is in the state. And then, yeah, and we have the sense of being acquainted with them. I think that's actually referring to some theory that Chalmers has, which I actually don't know much about, but whatever. So yeah, so maybe, so this is, so we're approaching the end slowly, but so what does this mean for like science and theories of consciousness? And I mean, this will also be very just high level, nothing too in depth, but I think one lens through which we can look at existing theories of consciousness is whether they actually necessitate meta problem processes. So meta problem processes being the processes that actually make organisms think that consciousness is puzzling. Because if a theory of consciousness says mechanism M is responsible for consciousness, but mechanism M has nothing to do with actual meta problem processes, then it's kind of strange, right? Then we would again be in the situation where, the fact that we're talking about consciousness, phenomenal consciousness, is just a huge coincidence and has nothing to do with the actual fact of having it. So, for example, IIT. So, the question is, how could integrated information account for problem intuitions? And now here, this is tough, obviously, because IIT is an example of a non-functional theory in a lot of respects. So for every system, we can build a 0-phi equivalent system with the same intuitions and the same reports. And that means that, strictly speaking, integrated information is not necessary for producing meta problem processes, which is kind of weird. And actually, I think that's maybe one of the best sort of counter arguments against IIT. Now, I think maybe it's not a knockdown argument, because you could always argue that, okay, yes, sure, you can build some 0-phi equivalent system that does also report, problem intuitions, but maybe you could introduce some constraints, right? You could say, okay, sure, you can build that system, but it's completely unrealistic physically, right? Because a feed-forward equivalent of a RNN just explodes in terms of complexity. So maybe if you add something like that, some sort of expectation on your system shouldn't become too big. I don't know, but I guess things are not looking too good for IIT. Now for global workspace theory, so here the question is, how could the global workspace account for problem intuitions? Now, definitely the good news is that problem reports obviously are only possible if they're globally broadcast. Now that's good, because that means some kind of global workspace or some kind of global broadcasting seems necessary for meta problem processes. But of course, this is not enough to really explain the content of the problem intuitions or reports. So it's not incompatible with the meta problem, but it's not enough to solve it, at least up until this point. So finally, higher order thought theories, they would have to answer how higher order thoughts account for problem intuitions. And now again, the good thing here is that it seems like, based on what we discussed before, higher order concepts, higher order thoughts are definitely relevant when talking about introspection. So you need some representation of your own internal states. So that's good. It might be necessary. But again, it's not clear why higher order thoughts necessarily would lead to all these problem intuitions or the precise contents of the problem intuition. So it's not, again, not incompatible with the meta problem, but not enough. Okay, and finally, maybe, let's say we kind of find a solution to the meta problem. We find a nice computational model that answers why we think consciousness is weird. But that still, well, it depends on what the solution is, right? It's hard to really predict what it could tell us about sort of the ontological reality of consciousness, but it still leaves open many possibilities. And so basically Chalmers lists 3 illusionist possibilities and 3 realist possibilities. So on the illusionist side, there's obviously the extreme take, that you can expect from people like Dan Dennett, which is that phenomenal consciousness just doesn't exist. So this is, again, I think it's actually logically pretty consistent. And if you have a meta problem process, you're good, right? If you don't accept the axiom that there's anything that it is like to be you, and you find a meta problem process, you're good. That's all you need to show, really. But you could be more of a weak illusionist and say that, okay, phenomenal consciousness exists, but it is somehow reducible to functional properties. And so here, Chalmers distinguishes between lower order meta problem states, which is just these lower order representations that we talked about before that contribute to meta problem processes. So here the idea is that it's really these first order representations that are consciousness, even though maybe the higher order representations are necessary for us to formulate the meta problem, but it is the lower order representations that are actually conscious. Or you think the higher order representations are really the conscious ones, and the lower order ones are just sort of necessary for consciousness to arise. And then on the realist side, there's also the extreme case of, oh, there's no solution to the meta problem. Now, this would be kind of, imply, or at least it would definitely be true for some dualist theories, which think, okay, there's this special substance that causes consciousness and interacts with the physical world, but it does so in mysterious ways, and we can't describe it. So, I guess we can, it's probably not very interesting, this one. Then consciousness could correlate with the meta problem processes, but it could not have a sort of a causal influence on them. So this is kind of the view that also Chalmers expressed at some point. I don't know if he still believes it, but I find it kind of nice. It's a nice view, this idea of, for example, you have this one fundamental thing in physics, which could be, for example, information. It would be kind of like a John Wheeler interpretation of physics, where really information is the most fundamental thing in physics. And then this information has 2 aspects. It has the physical functional aspect of describing how one state goes into the next one. And then it has this intrinsic other aspect of what is this information? What does it feel like to be this information? But of course, the problem here is that it's kind of, it is kind of epiphenomenal, and it would be hard to really argue against the argument that, oh wow, if that's the case, it's a complete coincidence that we're talking about it in the right way. Maybe there's some principles that you come up with that shows, oh, these 2 aspects of information processing have to be linked. There needs to be some isomorphism maybe between them, but there's no way I could imagine how that could be done at this point, but maybe it could. And then the third option is consciousness realizes them at least causally. Oh, Guess it stopped recording. Oh no, it didn't. Oh, it stopped sharing. It stopped sharing. Okay. So yeah. So the last option would be consciousness realizes the meta problem processes. So that would really give consciousness separate ontological existence with causal influence. But yeah, it's also really hard to imagine what that could be. Maybe some panpsychist maybe idea of there's certain fundamental parts of physics that actually are consciousness or something like that. But yeah, I mean, so despite I think identifying as a realist, it's really hard for any of these to be true, kind of, but or to imagine them being true. Uh, yeah. So to conclude, I think what's nice, or to put this onto perspective in terms of the greater landscape of, or the greater spectrum of views about consciousness. Again, as we discussed, so there's this realist and illusionist camp, and of course it's a spectrum. There's also weak illusionists, and sure there's different kinds of realists, but on the extremes of the spectrum you have that on the one end that phenomenal consciousness does not exist, which is seems very strange to me and to a lot of people. And then on the other hand, though, you have the idea that consciousness is an epiphenomenon and has actually no real causal influence on physics, which is also really weird because then why would we talk about it? So basically, Chalmers advocates for maybe us all moving a bit into the center. So the strong illusionists kind of need to address the fact that it is something that is like to be a conscious system. I mean, of course, they can also not, but I think most people think that this should be addressed. And then, but at the same time, and this is really where the meta problem comes in, the realists really have to face up to the fact that if consciousness is just an epiphenomenon, then it would be super strange, and we'd probably be wrong about our ideas about consciousness because there's no reason, or it would be a huge coincidence if we were right. So, in some sense, the meta problem takes maybe the realist ideas, but brings them back in the realm of science and back to a place where we can actually work with them experimentally. All right.